Look, drove to the Oldsmobile dealer, asked him if there was any chance of coming near to the motel we had had, and the dealer smiled and said, "You're not going to believe this." He ushered us into the service area where they had just finished preparing a wagon that looked to be a literal resurrection of our station wagon, and he was right. I couldn't believe it, except that I had a hunch that God was smiling pretty wide. And with the insurance money, this one cost hardly anything, and they filled out the papers on the spot. Next, the insurance agent offered to replace the trailer, but I allowed as how maybe we could make do without a trailer, so he reimbursed us the full amount in cash. I couldn't wait to see Joanne's face when I pulled into the motel and shared the good news. All she did was shake her head and say, "Oh, wow," over and over. That same day, we were back on the road, looking forward to our interim destination and whatever God might have in store for us, and all in less than 24 hours after our accident. Again, we praised the Lord, and this time there were 5 voices raised in worship. It had been dark for some time when we pulled up in the drive to the Corn Ranch. We had called ahead to let them know we were coming and get final instructions, and all the lights seemed to be on when we arrived. Lee came out to greet us. It was hard to believe that this radiant young mother of only 30 years had any affliction at all, let alone one that was apparently about to take her life. In just a few moments, we realized that we were in the home of one of God's most beloved and cherished children. Her husband, Walt, was a gruff, hard-bitten rancher who made his living taking people on pack trips up into the mountains. Walt was polite but aloof, and it was obvious that he was on his best behavior simply because our visit meant so much to the woman he openly adored. As soon as he graciously could, he excused himself. After showing our kids to bed, he retired himself, and he left Lee and Mary and I to carry on about the Lord as long as we liked. Lee was so full of joy and thanksgiving that sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. In the presence of her enthusiasm, any weariness of our own was soon forgotten. In fact, Mary and I both loved her so much we felt as if we'd known her for years. That night and the following, she confided to us that the deepest desire of her heart was for Walt to come to know Christ before she died. This she had revealed to her prayer group. Several ladies who, like herself, were reaching out for a deeper spiritual walk. It was through them that she had received my book. None of them, Lee said, actually knew of anyone who had been healed by prayer, but they'd read about it and they decided to agree in prayer that God would somehow bring me to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And they felt that if I did come, God could use me to do some very important things in their lives. One such thing Lee believed was that if I were to come and pray for her, God would grant her heart's desire and save Walt. And so she laughed. That was the reason why. On the one hand, I was so surprised and delighted when you called, but on the other hand, I wasn't really surprised at all. And that night in the cool mountain air, we slept like logs. It seemed that scarcely an hour had passed when I woke to hear Lee in the kitchen, humming softly and preparing breakfast. Outside, the sun was high and poking an impatient finger through the place where the window shade did not quite close it out. I yawned heavily and tried to bring my wrist watch into focus. 9:00 a.m. I thanked the Lord for letting us sleep so late, and I got up as quietly as I could to keep from waking Mary. No use. And I reminded myself that I should give up everything I could get up without waking her. Later that morning, I could tell that Walt was seeking some way to show his gratitude for our coming and the tremendous lift it seemed to be for Lee. He asked me how I would like to take a pack trip on horseback up into the Grand Tetons. Tetons? Sorry. I replied with great joy that I had dreamed all of my life of taking such a trip and how much I had enjoyed seeing the Grand Tetons the evening before as we'd approached. I asked how much it would cost to take such a trip because I knew this was his livelihood. I intended to pay the full price. Well, it could cost $80 a day, he said, but I'm not going to charge anything. I'd just like to do it for you. I started to object, but got a check in my spirit and accepted with gratitude. There's just one thing, Walt. I don't see how I could go without Mary. We try to do everything together. Well, I'll take her too. So I got another nudge, and in obedience, I had to speak. I had to speak again. Well, there is something else. This is our vacation, the first real one we've had that we've been able to take the kids along. And the older two would really be disappointed if we left them behind. Well, I'll take all of you. So Walt began to make plans to take us up into the mountains. He alerted his trail cook and handyman, and told them to get ready as quickly as possible for an unscheduled trip. It took 2 days to get the equipment all ready, and we spent those days with Lee. She took us around to meet her prayer partners and other Christian friends, and we found them as open and enthusiastic as she was. Every place we went, they asked when I was going to talk to them. We decided that they could go ahead and announce a meeting at one of their homes, and we scheduled it for the same night that we'd returned from the pack trip. Merlin, said Lee, as we headed home that afternoon, I'll be praying the whole time you're on the trip that the Lord will open up just the right opportunity for you to speak to Walt. I nodded, and she looked out the car window and bit her lip. I'm afraid he's what you would call gospel hardened. I may have pushed a bit when I first came to know Jesus, or he just figures he doesn't need the Lord. And she sniffed and went on. Walt's so proud of his self-reliance. My illness is the first thing I've ever seen that has actually got to him. We turned in the drive, and she made a determined effort to regain her cheerfulness. Well, as I say, a lot of people have tried to convert him, even ministers, and he's proud they haven't had any effect on him. But I'll be praying, she said brightly. And in the house, Joanne and Bruce were as excited about the now imminent trip as I was, and Mary, who had only been on a horse a couple of times in her life, was praising the Lord. Now, you had all better get to bed early tonight, Walt said after dinner. In fact, you all get all the rest you can, because you're going to need it. Praise the Lord, I heard Mary murmur. I'm going to finish the story. The alarm went off at 5 o'clock the next morning, and this time there was no friendly shaft of sunlight poking around in the shade. Rosy-fingered dawn was not to make its appearance for another hour or so. It was essential that we set out as early as possible because we had a lot of ground to cover to reach our base camp high up in the mountains. Mount up, called Walt, and almost as soon as we stepped out the door, and there stood 6 mounts and 3 pack horses stamping their feet. Their nostrils streamed in the crisp pre-dawn air. Joanne, who was an accomplished horsewoman, fairly glided into the saddle, and I managed well enough, as did Bruce, who needed only a hand up. But poor Mary needed help getting up in the saddle, and I thank the Lord for giving Walt the insight to pick his most gentle mare for her. So we started up. Walt was in the lead, of course, followed by 3 pack horses, then Bruce, me, Mary, Joanne, and bringing up the rear to make sure none of us got lost, the cook and the handyman. Up we went, and up and up and up and up. In the first hour, we thoroughly enjoyed the excitement of being on a mountain trail, smelling the fresh wood smells, listening to the hoofbeats, craning to look back at the valley and the house where we'd started from. And we went over the first mountain ridge, going down for a short spell before starting up again, and we began to see new horizons 50 and 100 miles away. Most memorable of all was when Walt suddenly raised his hand. We all stopped and looked where he was pointing. Scarcely 100 yards away, a huge herd of elk, too many to count, was grazing on a grassy slope. We stayed as still as we could, not daring to breathe, but they looked right at us and went on feeding unconcernedly, either sensing that we meant them no harm or simply never having learned to fear man. All at once, one of them got it in mind to take off, and almost as one, the rest were in motion too. They ran together like a flowing gray river, and in tremendous, continuous, unbelievably graceful leaps, cleared fallen trees, boulders, or anything in their path. They ran so silently that when they were gone and the slope was empty, we almost wondered if we hadn't imagined them. We also saw deer and coyotes, but after the first hour we were more concerned with the alarming discovery that our saddles seemed to be getting rougher and rougher. Our seats, used to nothing harder than the front seat of a car or a living room sofa, began to feel increasingly sensitive. A few more hours, which seemed a day long each, and we reached a beautiful grassy valley with a stream of mountain water burbling over the rocks in the sunlight. Walt again raised his hand, and we dismounted, none of us gracefully. Practically all of us needed more than a little assistance. As Mary and I stood there looking down at the clearest water I'd ever seen, she leaned over and whispered to me, "Merlin, I'm thirsty." And I looked back at the pack horses and our own, and I noticed that there were no canteens on any of them. I was embarrassed to say anything. By now it had grown quite warm, and we were exhausted. I finally went over and said, "Walt, we're thirsty." He was inspecting a shoe on one of the horses and looked up surprised. He says, "Well, go over there and get a drink." "Drink that?" I said, sounding stupid and not caring. "That's stream water." "Well, we can't drink that water," I said, thinking of 20 years in the Army, training and carrying water purification tablets. "Just drink the water," he said, trying not to sound impatient with the tenderfoot in front of him. "I've been drinking it for years. It's pure," he added pointedly, "just the way God made it." Well, with all sorts of visions of strange diseases and organic malfunctions,